Okay, now that you have finished Unit 5, which was all about factoring quadratic equations, we are now going to move into a couple different ways to solve quadratic equations. Now, if you remember, a quadratic equation is an equation that has basically a squared in it. So a lot of times it'll be like x squared plus 3x plus 5 equals 0, something to that effect. Okay, the part that makes it quadratic is the square. Okay, if there was no square in it, right, if it was just like x plus 5 equals 7, that's a linear equation. It makes a line. Okay, quadratic equations make what are called parabolas, and we'll talk about those later on as we get through this unit. But what we're doing today is we're going to start off this unit by talking about solving quadratic equations by taking the square root. And we are on page 1 of Unit 6. Okay, when you think about square roots, okay, you think about, in your notes it has the square root of 16. Okay, and when you think about the square root of 16, the answer to that is 4, right, typically. Okay, now here's the deal. The square root of 16 just means what number squared is 16, right? So 4 squared is 16. But you could also have the answer as negative 4 squared is 16. Okay, so you have to be careful here when we're talking about taking the square root of something. We're actually now going to talk about having its answers be both positive and negative. So you got to be aware of that situation, okay? It also shows on here the square root of negative 16. Okay, now hopefully you realize that that's not possible, right? No number squared can be a negative. So the answer here would be undefined, okay, or not. It's just not an answer, right? Okay, and then finally on that line right there towards the top, it says you can only solve quadratic equations by taking the square root. Okay, when, we're going to put when, okay, and on the blank you're going to put the square, well, how about the square, not the square root? When the square is isolated. And if you remember back from Unit 1, did it from Unit 2 as well. Okay, when the square is isolated, isolated means when it's by itself. Okay, and it jumps right into some examples here. I'm actually going to give you an example first before we move on, just kind of show you what we're talking about here. Okay, so let's say for instance we gave you the number x squared is equal to 16. Okay, so that equation right there basically says what number squared is 16. Okay, now hopefully in your head you know, well, I know that 4 squared is 16. Okay, but mathematically, in order to solve this problem, what you need to do is how do you cancel out a square? And the way you do that is by taking the square root of the square. Okay, so the square root of x squared gives you x, right? The square root and the square cancel each other out and you're left with x. Okay, well, we know our rules, right? Whatever you do to one side, you have to do to the other. So the square root of 16 is 4. And there you go. So those are the steps you need to follow. So that's the step you need to follow to get your square to be just the x. Okay, now let's take a look at example 1 here, and this will hopefully kind of start making sense to you. Okay, so if you look at example 1, it gives us x squared minus 225 is equal to 0. Okay, and what we said in that line was the only way you can solve quadratic equations by taking the square root is when the square is isolated, right? Now in this case, is our square isolated? No. Okay, our x squared is not isolated, so that's what we're trying to get, right? We want to get this x squared. Okay, and I just totally pushed the wrong button. Okay, I want to get this x squared all by itself so that I can find out what x is by itself, right? So how do I get x squared by itself? Okay, well, hopefully you're thinking to yourself, well, we need to get rid of the minus 225, right? So how do we get rid of minus 225? Okay, back to simple solving equations, right? Plus 225 on that side, and they cancel each other out. Oh, I just wrote 222, 225. So we add 225 on this side as well. And you get x squared is equal to positive 225. Okay? Now, we have x squared all by itself. So how do we find what x is? We take the square root, and those cancel out, and we're left with x. And then whatever you do to one side, you got to do to the other. And the square root of 225, hopefully you remember all your square roots, that equals 15. There you go. So x in this case would be 15. Now, but it's not just 15, right? It could also be negative 15. So x is actually going to equal positive or negative 15. Okay? So don't forget that your answer could be positive or negative. Okay, so x is equal to positive or negative 15. All right, let's keep going through some of these examples here. All right, so we have, next one is 100x squared minus 81 is equal to 0. Now, we don't have our x squared all by itself yet, so let's add 81 to both sides. We have 100x squared is equal to 81. That x squared still isn't by itself, right? So we got to divide by 100. And you have x squared is equal to 81 over 100. So now our square is isolated. So now we take the square root, and you get x is equal to, and then we take the square root of the other side. Now hopefully you remember when you take the square root of a fraction, you just basically take the square root of the top over the square root of the bottom, right? So the square root of 81 is 9, and the square root of 100 is 10, and our answer can be positive or negative. And there you go. Okay? It's a pretty simple process. You already know how to do most of it. You just have to remember how to put it all together. Okay, let's keep on moving. Alright. Next one, example 3, we have x squared plus 36 is equal to 0. Subtract 36. X squared equals negative 36. So we take the square root of x squared. You get x equals the square root of negative 36, which is not possible, right? Okay, so that's going to be not possible. Okay, if you flip over to page 2, you have 4 try these here at the front. Actually, you know what? Before we do that, let's. I see one of the examples in the try these is a little different than the rest of the ones that you have there. So I'm going to show you this one really quick before you move on. What happens if I give you something like this? X plus 3 squared equals 25. Okay, well, in this case, the x plus 3, the whole amount of that is being squared. Okay, so it's not just a part of it. You don't have to distribute it. Okay, here's what you do. You actually just go straight to taking the square root. Okay, so what we're going to do, we're going to take the square root of this whole thing, and then the square root and the square go away, and you're left with x plus 3. Okay, and now we take the square root of the other side, and you have plus or minus 5. Okay, now in this case, our x is not by itself yet. So what we need to do, let me see if I can shrink this thing down here. Okay, what we need to do is we actually need to set this equal to x plus 3 is going to be equal to 5, or x plus 3 is going to be equal to negative 5. Okay, and then we're going to go ahead and solve those to get our final answer. So we subtract 2 from both sides. So x can equal 3, or we subtract 3. Oh, I don't know how I got that. Sorry about that. I should have been subtracting 3. It should be x equals 2. Or we subtract over here and you get x equals negative 8. So our answers could be 2 or negative 8. Okay, that's what x could equal. And if you plug it back into the original equation, right, we have this x plus 3 squared. So if we had 2 plus 3 squared equals 25, 2 plus 3 is 5 squared. And there you go, that's correct. Okay, or if you do negative 8 plus 3 squared, that gives you negative 5 squared is 25. And that, it makes sense, that's why those work, okay? Alright, now try these a shot and see what you find. Okay, so let's take a look here at the try these. So the first one, we have x squared minus 2 equals 98. So plus 2 to both sides to get x squared by itself. X squared equals 100. Take your square root. And x equals 10. And you're going to do plus or minus 10, right? Okay, let's look at the next one. 4n squared equals 64. So to get the n squared by itself, we divide by 4. We have n squared equals 16. Take the square root, and you have n equals positive or negative 4. There you go. Okay, there's one we were looking at right there at the end, right? Okay, so we have x minus 5, and because it's in parentheses, we need to leave it just like it is, squared. Okay, and we'll just take the square root of it. So we have x minus 5 equals plus or minus 3. And then we have x minus 5 equals 3, or x minus 5 equals negative 3. So we're going to add 5. X is equal to 8. Add 5. X is equal to positive 2. And those are your two answers. There you go. And finally, let's look at the last one. I'll change to white for this one. Let's add 49 to both sides. You got negative 81 x squared equals 49. Still have to divide by this negative 81. Uh-oh, hopefully you're seeing we have a problem, Houston. So x squared equals the square root. Oh, sorry, I'm kind of combining two steps, I'm sorry. Square root of x squared is equal to the square root of 49 over negative 81. And you can't have a negative inside of a square root, so we'll just leave it right there. I guess you could technically take the square root of the 49, and you'd have 7 over the square root of negative 81, but, you know, why would you really do that? So we'll just leave it right like that, and that is our final answer. Okay, and that's actually undefined, right, because it's a negative in there. Alright, so there's the first part of this unit. Okay, solving by taking the square root. Hopefully this all makes sense. Let me know if you have any questions.